Hello. Sorry, I'm a little late. Got here. Matthew Bernhardt King. Good, because I've got a lot of difficult questions. I think only Matthew can take care of them. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, we got 7 people. We're going to rock and roll because that's the way I roll. I can figure out which thing to share with you. There it is. Today, people, we will be talking about hemodynamics. Hemodynamics. So far we've talked about the cellular aspects of the cardiovascular system, right? What's going on inside smooth muscle cells and cardiac cells. We've talked about the larger aspects of it, contraction of smooth muscle, contraction of the heart, and then the control of it with the autonomic nervous system. Now we're going kind of a step higher, like we keep stepping back and back and back. So now we're looking at kind of whole body responses to changes in cardiac activity and vascular activity. So this is kind of a good way of kind of organizing it all at once. I've got a different one myself in the end, but we're going to walk into it slowly in case you're not familiar with this from other classes. Okay, hemodynamics. So hemodynamics is the dynamics of the blood, basically, blood movement. So we've got 3 things that are important here. Cardiac output, how much blood is being put into the balloon, as I like to say. So you can think of the, it's a closed cardiovascular system. So, you put more volume into it, the system gets bigger and there's more wall tension. So cardiac output affects blood pressure. Total peripheral resistance, which is kind of like the hole in the balloon, right? If you've got a big balloon and there's a hole at one end that's regulated, okay, blood will keep going through it as long as you keep putting blood into it. You crunch it down, it's going to get bigger and you're going to get more pressure inside the system. And then blood pressure, which is what we're looking at. So basically, cardiac output and total peripheral resistance are controlled by sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system, mostly sympathetic, but also some PNS in the heart. And then the output is blood pressure. So we're not directly controlling blood pressure or looking at blood pressure here. Blood pressure is the, kind of the dependent variable, I guess, based on what's going on with cardiac output and total peripheral resistance. So the baroreceptors sense blood pressure and they feed back on the cardiac output and resistance to control blood pressure to keep it where it needs to be. So how does this work? The law of hemodynamics. If you've taken physics, you know anything about electricity, it's basically the same equation. Voltage is the pressure of the electrons. Resistance is the difficulty to get electrons through a resistor. And current is how many electrons are going through that resistor. So here we've got blood pressure, total peripheral resistance, and total peripheral resistance, remember, is always sympathetic nervous system. That's the only control. So peripheral resistance is all about the contractile state of the arterioles, which are the resistance vessels. If you remember from the last lecture, the large arteries are more capacitance. They're absorbing that pulsatile pressure and releasing it to get you into a constant flow state. But your arterioles are where the peripheral resistance is being controlled. So and the only innervation of those arterioles is sympathetic. So total peripheral resistance is always controlled by your sympathetic nervous system. And cardiac output, how much blood is going out of the heart. And you can look at it 2 different ways. You can look at it this way or this way. And, I always look at it this way, but this might be a better way in that this is our output. So we're looking at this and how these affect that. And we looked at this on Tuesday as well. Kind of gives you a visual idea of how this is affecting how these parameters are affecting blood flow and blood pressure. I don't think I need to do that again. Okay, here we are. Law of hemodynamics. So if cardiac output increases, so this is the way I want you to start looking at this. If this goes up, what happens to this over here? And it's just like math. If you've got a mathematical equation, you change one side, the other side changes as well to keep it equal. So if cardiac output increases, total peripheral resistance stays the same. What happens to blood pressure? So CO goes up, this is constant. What happens to blood pressure? It has to go up, right? To keep both sides equal. So if you're putting more blood, pumping more blood into the same balloon, the pressure on the wall is going to increase. So cardiac output increases blood pressure. If total peripheral resistance decreases and the cardiac output remains the same, what happens to blood pressure? So what's the effect of total peripheral resistance? If it goes down, blood pressure also goes down. So you've relaxed the walls of that balloon and you've made a bigger balloon, and so the pressure inside of it comes down. So again, this is kind of how we need to start looking at it. Now, there's a lot of complicated things that go into cardiac output. First, we'll talk about, cardiac output. Okay, so these are the two things that go into cardiac output, and a lot of things go into stroke volume. That's the complicated one. But cardiac output then is milliliters of blood per minute. Heart rate is beats per minute, and stroke volume is mils per beat. So I love to be able to kind of look through the math. So we don't just have random units here. These units make sense, and it kind of helps you to understand what's going on. So heart rate, number of beats per minute, right? Stroke volume is number of mils per beat. So if you multiply beats per minute by mils per beat, the beats cancel out and you end up with mils over minute, which is this over here, mils per minute. Except that, escape. Should be a capital L, I believe. Okay, mils per beat, mils per minute. Okay, so if stroke volume increases, cardiac output increases, right? This goes up because they're equal to each other. This has to go up. So stroke volume is going to have a direct effect on cardiac output. If heart rate increases, more beats per minute, same stroke, mils per beat, cardiac output is going to go up. Okay, so again, this may seem simple, but towards the end, we'll get a lot bigger equations and more complicated relationships. So this is the way you need to be looking at it. Now, if both go up, right, beta stimulation, you're increasing heart rate because of the SA node, beta receptors in the SA node, increasing stroke volume because of increased contractility of the heart. Now cardiac output goes up a lot, and that's what we're seeing with epinephrine. And epinephrine will have other effects on stroke volume besides increasing contractility, which we'll see shortly. Okay, this is called cardiac reserve, okay? When you're at rest, you have a certain cardiac output, and it's just taking care of your basic metabolic needs. When you exercise, you need a lot more oxygen to your tissues, and so your heart works harder, puts out more blood, which brings more oxygen to the tissues. That's called cardiac reserve, the difference between baseline and what you're capable of, okay? And that's kind of an important term because when we talk about congestive heart failure or heart failure in general, you lose that cardiac reserve. And that's usually the first symptom of, or one of the first symptoms of heart failure, in that you can't exercise anymore. You don't have that cardiac reserve because your heart is working as hard as it can just to meet basic metabolic needs. That's the compensatory mechanism of the heart. So you don't really notice symptoms because your heart's keeping up with the needs, so you don't really notice it. The only time you notice it is when you need that reserve and you don't have it because you're already using it to meet your basic needs. Okay, heart rate is controlled by sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And we talked about this already. Just to review, sympathetic nervous system activates beta receptors, which activates GS, increases cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP then directly increases that funny current, which increases the slope, makes the slope steeper, And so you get more frequent depolarizations and an increased heart rate. Parasympathetic nervous system does the opposite, activates GI, which decreases cyclic AMP. That decreases the funny current, and also the beta gamma subunit of GI will activate the potassium channel. I don't know if we talked about that at the time, but it's kind of important. It's kind of interesting too, in that, typically we talk about the G protein coupled receptor activating the G protein, and the alpha subunit goes off and does something. Here's an example of the beta subunit doing something. Here it's activating a potassium channel. It's increasing your potassium current, and at this slope, you've got the funny current depolarizing and the potassium current trying to keep it polarized. So if you increase that potassium current and decrease the funny current, you get a much longer depolarization before you hit that threshold and get an action potential. Here's a question I'm going to throw out to the crowd. Let's make this let me see your faces real quick. Okay, oh my God, such good-looking students. Such good-looking students. I'm happy this morning. Except for Ariana, she's not happy at all. Coffee, baby. Gotta have some coffee. Okay, what is another function of the beta gamma subunit? What's another direct role this has in activating something that we talked about in the first test material for 5 big warrior points? 5 points. Matt, did you get that? 5 bonus points. 5 bonus points. What's another role for the beta gamma subunit? What's an active role that it plays in cells? I am way too silly. Nobody knows. Do I get to keep these bonus points? Uh-oh, Noemi fell over. Oh, well. There she is. Okay. Whew, I was worried about you there. Nobody knows. Holy shit. I'm going to keep these points for myself. Okay, the beta gamma subunit activates GRK. Remember GRK, G protein coupled receptor kinase, which then phosphorylates the receptor, and then beta arrestin comes in, binds to it, and you get downregulation of the receptor. Okay. Guess I'm putting that on the test next week. Is it next week? No, a couple of weeks. Okay. I hope it's not next week. We just finished a test. Okay, so that's decreasing heart rate. So heart rate is pretty simple in terms of what causes what. Heart rate is just sympathetic nervous system increases and you get an increase in cardiac output. Parasympathetic decreases and you get a decrease in cardiac output. So okay, so that's not a big deal. Now, much more complicated is stroke volume. First, we'll define stroke volume. Stroke volume is the difference between end diastolic volume and end systolic volume. So this is the volume in the ventricle when it's totally filled, and this is when it's through contracting. So when we contract, we subtract end systolic volume from the end diastolic volume, that's the stroke volume. There's another factor here that I didn't put in that, let me just put it in here now because I'm thinking about it. You're seeing behind the scenes here. I'm making my PowerPoint. Ejection fraction equals stroke volume divided by, stroke volume divided by end diastolic volume. So this is another factor we'll see, especially when we get into congestive heart failure. I'm just going to throw it out here for the pure hell of it. No, not for the pure hell of it, just to give you a little warning that this is coming. So typically we talk in terms of stroke volume, but when we're talking about performance of the heart, sometimes we'll talk about ejection fraction. So when the heart weakens, when the heart muscle weakens, that it has less contractility, so the ejection fraction decreases. You get less volume out for the contraction, and as a result, the heart starts to enlarge, and that's congestive heart failure. The heart gets bigger and bigger. Okay, end diastolic volume equal, or you heard that already. Okay, so how do we control stroke volume? The sympathetic nervous system contracts the veins, alpha receptors in the veins, IP3 calcium, contraction of the veins. This increases venous return. And I talked a little bit about this in the last section for some reason. I threw it out there ahead of time. It was important, I forget why. But anyway, if you increase the venous return, you're going to increase your end diastolic volume. And that will, in turn, increase stroke volume. Don't you love this animation I'm throwing in here? Okay, what else do we have? We've got end systolic volume. What's going to control your end systolic volume? One thing that's going to control that is your contractility, the contractility of the heart. So the sympathetic nervous system mainly is innervating the ventricle, and sympathetic nervous system causes a positive inotropy. Positive inotropy will decrease your end systolic volume. So you're contracting harder and more of the blood in the heart gets out. So that's decreasing your end systolic volume. And that will also increase systemic or stroke volume. So in general, your sympathetic nervous system is affecting both end diastolic volume and end systolic volume. And so because it's affecting both, it is greatly increasing stroke volume. And that's your cardiac reserve. Parasympathetic too, but parasympathetic's really only affecting your heart rate. So sympathetic nervous system, and there is some parasympathetic innervation in the atria especially, which will decrease end diastolic volume a bit, a little bit in the ventricles, but not so much. We don't worry that much about parasympathetic innervation of the heart except for heart rate. That's the major effect of parasympathetics in the heart. But sympathetic nervous system greatly increases stroke volume by increasing heart rate, increasing end diastolic volume because of venous return, and decreasing end systolic volume because of increased contractility. So let me just back up. So that's a really important aspect of cardiac output is your sympathetic nervous system. A couple other factors that weigh into this are preload and afterload. These are, we've kind of talked about preload already, but preload is the amount of stretch on the muscle before it starts to contract. And afterload is the load on the muscle as it's contracting. So what was I going to say? So these are terms, preload and afterload, that you see a lot in the literature and in really textbooks and things. So we need to define this as well. So your preload is venous return, basically. The more venous return you have, the more stretch on the muscle, and that's your preload. Afterload is total peripheral resistance. So what is the blood pressure that the heart is squeezing against in order to get the blood out? Okay, preload, wall tension before the muscle contracts. And this is determined by end diastolic volume. If you increase the venous return, you increase the end diastolic volume. This increases the stretch on the muscle and causes a positive inotropy. So this is positive inotropy that has nothing to do with sympathetic nervous system. It's just a function of the muscle itself. When you stretch it, the muscle contracts harder. And we can see this in the Frank-Starling curve. This is like a general Frank-Starling curve. This could be for any muscle. It could be smooth, skeletal, or cardiac muscle. The more you stretch a muscle passively, the stronger it contracts. So passive tension is the stretch on the muscle. And I used to do this in the lab with smooth muscle, get an aorta, cut it into, from a rat, cut it into little circles and put a wire on either side and stretch it. And the more you stretch it, the stronger it contracts up to a point. I think they used to do this in physiology. I don't know if they still do. Take the gastrocnemius muscle, the calf muscle from a frog, and put a weight on it and contract it, and then put a stronger weight on it, contract it, stronger weight. The more you stretch it, the harder it contracts. And the reason for that is because of the overlap of the myosin and actin thin and thick filaments. So here, when you're not stretched at all, you can see these thin filaments here are not interacting with myosin heads. So you're not going to get a really strong contraction if you don't have maximal actin myosin overlap, right? That's where you're going to get your strongest contraction, where you have maximal overlap, the most myosin heads grabbing actin and contracting. As you stretch it out, okay, here you've got fewer of these thin filaments that are not interacting with myosin. You're getting stronger contraction. And here you get maximal overlap between actin and myosin. And that's your strongest contraction. The muscle will start to fail if you pull it more than that, though, because here, as you get past that point, now you've got fewer actin-myosin interactions. Pull it even further, you get even less, and you can just, of course, tear the muscle apart, and then it'll never contract again. But that's what the Frank Starling curve is all about. And again, skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscle all works this way. In terms of stretch, like we just said, of the cardiac muscle, venous return is stretching the muscle. So if you've got a small amount of venous return, you get a little bit of stretch, not perfect overlap, and you get less contraction. So here, let me go over the axes here. Left ventricular end diastolic pressure, right? Left ventricular end diastolic pressure. So that's right at the end of the diastole, how much has the heart stretched out? And this is stroke volume. So as you decrease ventricular filling, you get a less strong contraction. As you increase that stretch, you get a stronger contraction. So again, this is a positive inotropy, which has nothing to do with sympathetic nervous system. It's just a function of the muscle. And this left ventricular end diastolic pressure is due to the venous return. Positive inotropy. So the inotropic nature of the heart changes based on its physiological state, right? So this is your normal as you're just at rest, the inotropy of the heart. If you exercise, okay, you're going to stimulate release of mostly norepinephrine, but if you're really, really working hard, a lot of epinephrine too, and that will increase the ability of the muscle to contract at different stretch amounts, okay? So this is stretch going from here to here is stretch, and here to here is performance. So this is what we just saw, where you just have a normal heart that's not being stimulated by sympathetic nervous system, and how stretch changes the stroke volume. So that's just venous return. Now we add beta stimulation of the heart directly, and you've got even greater change in inotropy for the same amount of ventricular stretch, okay? And that is, again, because you activate beta adrenergic receptors, alpha GS, cyclic AMP, protein kinase A. Protein kinase A phosphorylates the calcium channels, more trigger calcium, phosphorylates the ryanodine receptor, FKBP comes off, more release of calcium during the more activator calcium release, phosphorylation of phospholamban, it comes off the pump, more loading of calcium into the heart. So for all these reasons, you're getting a stronger contraction for the same amount of stretch. So dyspnea and pulmonary edema. So dyspnea is fainting, basically. So here in your heart failure situation, when you get more venous return, you give yourself more venous return, you don't get that much increase in inotropy. So you're trying to get your heart to move, and it's really not, and you tend to faint. And here's kind of fatal myocardial depression. So your heart is like really needing a lot, or your body's really needing a lot more. Okay, we've got to chat. Heart's really needing a lot more, and so it's putting a lot of venous return in the heart, but the heart isn't able to get that blood out, so the pressure backs up from the left ventricle back through the pulmonary artery to the lungs. You've got high kind of high pressure in the pulmonary artery, that pressure backs up to the capillaries in the lungs, and it forces fluid out into the alveoli, and that's pneumonia. And that's how usually people die of heart failure in the end. That, or they go into arrhythmia and the heart just stops. Okay. Let's get this chat. Come on, baby. Chat. Okay. Question. Would bodybuilders whose muscles appear always contracted, would they have constant higher levels of norepinephrine or epinephrine compared to average people? No, because here you're talking about skeletal muscle. This is actually a good question. Skeletal muscle is a little bit different. Their muscles always appear a little contracted because they get more muscle tone. The more you use your muscles, the more muscle tone you get, and so they seem a little contracted all the time. And that has to do with your, I believe, your cerebellum. I don't know. I'm making that up, but anyway, it's a central mechanism that's causing slight contraction at all times. The other question that could be asked here is, what about an athlete who's like a long distance runner? You know, basically a lot of cardiac exercise. So your heart is getting stronger. Basically, what happens there with those people? This actually will, I believe, come down this way a little bit. So, what am I trying to say? Well, someone who exercises a lot will have a lower heart rate because with a stronger heart, it doesn't have to beat as much to get the correct amount of cardiac output. So let's back up to. So if you've got a stronger heart, then your stroke volume, your baseline inotropy is more than the average person. So you get a better stroke volume for every beat. So the heart rate drops. So that's one of the positive aspects of exercise, which I used to do. One of the positive aspects of exercise is your heart rate drops because your heart's in better condition and you get more stroke volume for each beat. So your inotropy is a lot stronger at under a normal condition, non-stimulated. Okay. Is this where I was? Okay. Nope. Okay. So again, that's your cardiac reserve. Your ability to go from here up to there with beta stimulation. Okay, pressure volume loops. These are, we talked about these when we were talking about just the basic contraction of the heart. And what I said then was just generally what this is talking about. Now we're going to look a little more in depth at it to see how pressure volume loops can help to explain changes in cardiac output. So if you remember, this is isovolumic relaxation. So that's when this is the first part of diastole, the heart has stopped contracting and now it's decreasing in pressure until the pressure inside the ventricle goes below the pressure in the atrium. Let's just talk about the left side. And then the mitral valve opens and now the muscle starts to stretch as it's filling. Now it's filling a lot. Here's stroke volume. Here's the volume is increasing a lot, but the pressure isn't increasing much. So this is a very shallow line here. And that's again because that muscle can stretch a lot before it starts to reach the end of its stretch and tension starts to increase. See, if you filled a lot more, that's what would happen. But anyway, here we are. During diastole is from here down to here, isovolumic, and now we're stretching the vessel out as we're increasing venous return. Stimulation happens here, isovolumic contraction, the aortic valve opens, and then you're pushing blood out, and then diastole again. So what happens when preload increases? Preload is your venous return. You get a greater venous return, which means this stretches out further before the systole starts, and then you get more blood coming out because you've got more blood in it. You've increased the inotropy of the heart. So stroke volume is basically the difference between this and this, right? This is end systolic pressure. This is end diastolic pressure, or volume, I mean, end diastolic volume. So you're increasing that end diastolic volume, so you're getting a greater stroke volume. Afterload. So afterload is the pressure that the heart sees when it starts to contract. So that's your blood pressure. So, it's the pressure that, the amount of pressure you have to get in your ventricle before that aortic valve opens and you can push against it. And then once it is open, what pressure are you pushing against? So if you decrease your arterial pressure, you've got less load to push against and you can get more blood out. So here's your stroke volume under normal conditions. And right here, we hit with something like a calcium channel blocker, which is going to cause your resistance vessels to relax without really changing the heart directly much at all. So you decrease systemic vascular resistance, and then boom, your stroke volume increases because you're pushing it against less. And so boom, there's your stroke volume, much bigger. So increasing afterload decreases stroke volume, decreasing afterload increases stroke volume. And it just makes sense, if you have say if you've got a really heavy weight, to pick it up is really hard. A lighter weight you can pick up a lot easier. So the heart's just pushing against a lesser weight, so it's able to get more blood out. Here's the effect of changing afterload on stroke volume. Afterload, increase afterload, decrease stroke volume. So, okay, I couldn't see this gray one at first. I'm like, what's going on here? Uh-oh. I clicked on it accidentally. This stupid touchpad I have is driving me bonkers. Okay, so here's your normal, okay? You increase afterload. That means that you're getting a little more filling here, but a lot less emptying. So what we're seeing here is, let's see, this is normally your end systolic volume. And when you increase your afterload, you get less blood out during the contraction. So your end systolic volume increases. So when you've got an increased end systolic volume, you're going to get a little more stretch because you're still filling. You can't quite fill as much because there's more pressure in there to begin with. So you can't fill as much, but you're filling more than you would have without this increased afterload. And then now you have to push against a higher pressure, so you're not getting as much out. Okay, so there's your pressure volume curve showing the effect of afterload. Basically, the whole thing shifts this way and up, right? And it's up because this is pressure, right? And so when you increase afterload, increasing resistance increases pressure. So it's a lot higher and it shifts to the right. And most importantly, your stroke volume is decreasing. Oh my God, summary already. I'm almost done with my lecture. How does this keep happening? Okay, just to go through this slowly a bit. What am I doing here? All right, increasing venous return increases preload, and that increases stroke volume. Okay, increasing venous return, increasing stretch, increasing inotropy, increasing stroke volume. If you do the opposite, decrease venous return, decreasing preload, decreasing stroke volume. Increasing systemic vascular resistance is increasing afterload, and that decreases stroke volume because you're pushing against a higher pressure. If you decrease systemic vascular resistance, you decrease the afterload and decrease stroke volume. Okay, so let's put this all together. I'm going to ask you some questions in a quiz this weekend that will talk about this. So use this as kind of your flow chart to answer the questions in the quiz I'm giving you this weekend. Okay, cardiac output is equal to blood pressure over total peripheral resistance. And you can also put it out this way, cardiac output is equal to heart rate times stroke volume. So total peripheral resistance is controlled by your sympathetic nervous system. If you increase SNS, you increase total peripheral resistance. And if you're increasing TPR, you're decreasing cardiac output. okay? And now we know it's because you're decreasing stroke volume, okay? You're pushing it at higher pressure, you can't put as much blood out, decreased stroke volume. Your heart rate, there's only one thing interacting with heart rate, and that is your autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system increases heart rate, increasing cardiac output. Parasympathetic nervous system decreases. Stroke volume. Now, this is the complicated one because there's a lot of things that go into it. Stroke volume is the end diastolic volume minus the end systolic volume. The end diastolic volume is controlled by your stretch, controlled by your venous return, which creates stretch, and that increases inotropy. But also your venous return is being controlled by the sympathetic nervous system because of the alpha receptors on the veins, the large veins in the heart. And remember, in the last lecture, we talked about how most of the blood in your body is in the venous side. You push more of that back to the heart, increase stretch, increase venous output or cardiac output. And systolic volume is controlled by a number of things. Inotropy, how hard is the muscle contracting? And that's controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. Mostly sympathetic nervous system, which is going to decrease end systolic volume by increasing or positive inotropy, increasing contractility. A little bit of PNS inhibition here, decreasing negative inotropy, decreasing contractility, decreasing end systolic volume, or increasing end systolic volume. Another thing that's going to affect end systolic volume is your afterload, which is over here. Okay, so this is the same thing more or less than what's going on over here. So increasing your afterload is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system, which is contraction of the arteries, giving you a higher total peripheral resistance, and that's that deal. Okay. Good Lord, it's only 10 after 10. Let's just stop share. There we go. Okie doke. Okay. Do we have any questions here? Any comments? Any discussion points? Oh, we lost Matt Bernhardt. Okay, again, I apologize for only a 40-minute lecture, but I think we're covering the material at the same rate I usually do. It's just different when it's online, so it's a lot harder. Bezawit, I'm going to talk to you after class. Let me send you a link, because last time I did that, it ended up in the recording. So I'll send you a link and we can talk after class. Anybody have any questions? Can you go over slide 17? Yes, I can. Indeed, I can. All right, so let's share again. Oh, I closed it. Hang on 1 second. Slide 17. Oh, our Starling curve. Starling did a lot of things. A lot of things are called Starling this or Starling that because he was an active MF. Where is it now? Come on. Come on, you son of a bitch. It's hard to find stuff in this share thing. Sitting office. Word. Oh, come on, man. Let's hang on 1 second. You bring this up. Now try my share. I'm sorry, this is just not as intuitive as it should be. There it is. Finally, it shows up. Okay, here's slide 17. So what I'm trying to say here is, let me back up one, is the stretch. So stretch on any muscle is going to increase its ability to contract up to a point. And so here we're looking at only part of this curve. Here we're looking at just this part of the curve. So as you decrease venous return, you're getting less stretch on the ventricle. Okay, you're just not filling as much, so it hasn't stretched as much. So its ability to contract is less, and so the stroke volume decreases. As you increase venous return, you stretch that muscle out more. It has a stronger contraction ability, and it forces more blood out. So that's your venous return. Oops. Come on, man. I just got another chat and I'm having a hard time pulling it up. Come on, man. Let's just stop the share. The slide with heart failure and the curve changing. Oh, okay. Let's go back to that. Okay. So we're going to talk about heart failure in more depth next week, I believe. I believe so. But anyway, heart failure. So here's the idea. This is a normal heart. Now, when you get into heart failure, the muscle is less able to contract. It's weaker. It can't contract as strongly. It's kind of like comparing you kids against me, because I'm pretty friggin' strong right now. So the muscle itself has less strength to it. And so the whole curve shifts down to here. So as you stretch the muscle, you can still get more out of it, but you can never get as much out of it as a normal heart because it just doesn't have the strength to do that. And we'll talk about why. It has to do with kind of a leaky ryanodine receptor. And so you're not getting enough calcium into the SR, or it's leaking, so you've got less calcium in the SR, so there's less activator calcium to release, so you get a less strong contraction. That's part of it. And also has to do with some of the other mechanisms. So we'll get into that next week. So Tyler, does that make sense? Or do you want me to explain that some more or in a different way? Does that make sense, Tyler? Okay, good. All right, any other questions or comments? Discussion points I have not covered? Okay, so I guess I'm going to let you go. I'm going to put a quiz up this week. Probably get it up in about an hour or so. A couple of questions for you to try and answer, I should say, because I know you're smart people. And then we'll discuss that next week. And next week we'll get into pathophysiological states. So at this point, I think we've covered everything about the normal contraction or the normal cardiovascular system. And next week we'll get into what happens when things go wrong. Okay, everybody happy? Okay, Bezowit, I don't know if I pronounce your name right. You never correct me. I'll send you a link right now and then we can talk.
Okay, thank you.
Email.